On this episode of The Word Made Fresh, we're going to talk about communion, specifically a radically immanent, non-ontotheologically sacramental approach to communion. Just stick with me. And then we're going to fly a drone. Oh, and we're going to take a walk. All right, let's go. Hi everyone, I'm Reverend Jim Keat, digital minister at the Riverside Church, and this is The Word Made Fresh, the weekly video Bible study, sermon prep resource thing where we talk about an upcoming lectionary passage, and then, you can comment, use this however you need, whether you're writing a sermon, leading a Bible study, or just, wanting a piece of online content to help kind of cultivate your spirituality right now. Got you covered. Okay. This week's lectionary passage is in Luke. It's the Emmaus Road story, and it's Luke chapter, I want to say 18? I'm just guessing now. Luke 24, verses 13. Wind, come on. Luke 24, verses 13 to 35. Now, that's a long passage. We're not going to read it all. We're going to get to the part I want us to focus on. You're probably familiar with this story. And like I said at the beginning, we're talking about communion. Yes, trust me. Just stick with me for a second. So this is the passage. It's, literally the day of Jesus' resurrection. Sorry, spoiler alert if you didn't know that happened. But Easter was a week ago, so I think you did by now. And these are two people, Cleopas and his friend. We don't really know his friend's name. Man, woman, wife, partner, cousin, neighbor, who knows? We'll let you write the fan fiction on that one. They're walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, which is a town west of Jerusalem, about 7 miles. So it's a long walk. They're heading there, and the story goes, this Emmaus Road, that's why it's called that, because it's the road to Emmaus. They're met by a stranger who's really not a stranger. It's Jesus. They just don't recognize him. Kind of like how in the Gospel of John, when Mary Magdalene goes and she's like, "Hello, Mr. Gardener, what did you do with Jesus?" It's really Jesus. The various Gospels have this theme of people not recognizing the resurrected Jesus, which is a whole other sermon. You could talk about what does it mean to have lenses to see resurrection around you. That's a good one. Okay, so two strangers walking to Emmaus, two friends walking to Emmaus, met by a stranger, don't know it's Jesus, start talking, catch up on all the things that have happened in Jerusalem, aka Jesus died and was buried and that whole thing. These two friends are followers of Jesus. They were a part of the whole crowd who was like, "We thought he was the one." And so Jesus is like, "You fools." He actually says, "You fools," or maybe not "you fools," but "Oh, how foolish you are." Oh, Jesus, always throwing shade. That's verse 25, by the way. And then they get to Emmaus, where the two friends were going, and Jesus, who they don't really know is Jesus still, is like, "I'm going to just keep on going." And the friends are like, "No, come, stay with us. It's a long walk. You don't want to be out by yourself at night. I heard this story about a person who was walking on the road to Jericho, and he got mugged, and this good Samaritan came and helped him. You don't want to be in that situation, so just come, stay the night with us." So Jesus, the stranger, who's Jesus, comes in, and they sit down and have a meal. This is where we get to communion. Now, in the text, it doesn't really say, "and then they had communion." But I think this is the first story of communion being shared, being celebrated after the resurrection. I mean, it's literally Sunday evening. It's the day, that evening of the resurrection. And here at that first meal we see people taking together, well, it's communion. Now let's get into why in a second, and then we're going to just talk about communion for a little bit, which will, if you're a theology nerd, you'll love it, and if you're not a theology nerd, well, you're going to become one. Okay, here's the communion part of the Emmaus Road story. When he was at the table with them, that's the stranger who's really Jesus, he took the bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. All right, we got a little David Copperfield moment going on at the end of this. We won't quite try to explain that. That's a whole other thing. But you see Jesus sitting down at a table with two friends. He takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, he gives it to them, and they recognized him. This is communion. I mean, it was just, literally 3 days earlier, he was at this Last Supper with his disciples and his friends. Maybe Cleopas and Cleopas's pal were there too. I don't know. And he did the whole Last Supper communion as we know it now. "Do this in remembrance of me. Take and eat, take and drink." Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, picks up this whole communion liturgy, and he says, "Anytime you eat and drink, you proclaim Jesus' resurrection." Well, here in this Emmaus Road story, whoa, the wind. Is it too windy? Hold on, let's move. All right, that should keep us out of the wind. We got a nice wall here. That serves as a wind block. Frankenmuth Elementary School, by the way. Okay, so Jesus shares this meal with two friends, and they recognize him. That's communion. When people share a meal together and recognize Jesus in the midst of that moment, the sacred in the mundane, that's what communion is. So I think this approach, in my mind, if we see this story as a communion story, which if you don't see it as a communion story, come on, we'll duke that out in the comments. I think this radically shifts what we understand communion to be. Too often, communion is this, certain people with certain outfits who know certain words say certain things, and then, we can eat this magic bread and magic wine or magic juice, and that's communion. I mean, I'm not knocking that approach. That's great. There is something really beautiful about priests and pastors and clergy creating spaces for people to encounter God in a very meaningful and spiritual way. And that's what those communion liturgies provide. Now, when they become like walls for only certain people can say the magic words or do the certain things, I think we got some problems. But okay, we'll duke that out in the comments too. But here's what I think about communion. And for me, this story reinforces a radically immanent, non-ontotheologically sacramental approach to communion. Let's just maybe pause from everything and unpack all of those words. By radically immanent, it's just this idea that God is present. God is always and already here, as opposed to, distant and far away and out there. I think too often we have an American tale theology. Where God is somewhere out there. No, a radically immanent theology says God is here. Immanent meaning like present, immanence, as opposed to transcendence. And radical, not like Ninja Turtles radical, but like the philosophical understanding of radical, meaning at the very core. The word radical means at the roots, actually. So radically immanent means God is always and already here. I mean, that's what you see in this story, period. Two people walking down the road, they meet a stranger and they find God in that stranger. God is radically immanent. This hails back to stories like Jacob taking a nap on the rock, waking up saying, "Surely God was in this place and I did not know it." Or Moses walking up to the burning bush, taking off his sandals because he's standing on ground that has always been holy, only he just realized it. Radical immanence means we open our eyes to discover God present all around us. That's part one of this. Part two is non-ontotheological. Now, ontotheology is a combination of ontology and theos, or God and kind of our sense of beingness. Ontology is the way we understand how we are being in the world. And so ontotheology would be saying there is this God who has this like conscious being, long gray beard throwing lightning bolts, or just some sort of like, God tips the scales one way or the other. God as a conscious being. So a non-ontotheological point of view says God is not a being, but God is the ground of being. Now, it's easy for us to kind of project personhood or beinghood onto God because that's what we are. We're people, we're beings. So it's very obvious that we would look into the kind of water and see our reflection and say, oh, look, God must be like that too. Only when I'm weak, God is strong. When I'm filled with anger, God is filled with love and benevolence. We kind of just project the opposite of our ontology and call that God. There's a theologian named Schleiermacher who has a lot of good stuff about this if you want to really go into the deep end, or just pick up whatever Heidegger you have lying around. He has a lot of things to say about ontotheology. So a non-ontotheological approach would be saying God is not some person up there, but God is kind of the energy, the ground of being that's always right here. That's kind of the radical immanence tied into it all. See how they're kind of a package deal? So radically immanent, non-ontotheologically sacramental communion. The sacramental part is key. Now, we've talked about this a little bit before. There was the video on baptism. I think I was at Tybee Island, Georgia. It's the video where I met a mermaid. Remember that one? Are you a mermaid?
Yeah. She sure is.
Why are you a mermaid? I talked about baptism and kind of talked about the various approaches to baptism. The same is true for communion. And really the divide comes from how you see it as an ordinance or a sacrament. This is true for baptism. This is true for communion. No, the ordinance side is where we see it more as a symbol, and really we, the people, bring our faith to this act. Whereas a sacrament is when we come to it recognizing God is the one working through this act, this encounter, this experience. So for baptism, the idea there is baptism an expression of my faith, or is baptism an expression of God's faith in me? That's the ordinance versus sacrament. The communion side would be kind of similar. Is this just me saying, I believe this, therefore I'll take communion to show my faith and express my belief? Or is communion a way in which I receive something from God? Now, a simple way to even dissect this is the verbs we use. I took communion versus I receive communion. I mean, some churches actually make that distinction. You will reach out, take it from the plate, and feed it to yourself. I'm the one doing the action. Versus other postures, this is largely in the Catholic Church, I know, where you will receive communion, or even they put it in your mouth even, because God is the one doing the action, we're the one receiving it. I grew up in the Lutheran Church where I was taught that the sacraments are means of grace. God is giving us grace and we receive it. Now, I'm not completely anti-ordinance on this, because I think there is an element where communion is recognizing that we are a part of this community and we're doing this thing together. Communion is never something you can do alone. Even if you're practicing communion online during all this COVID-19 stuff, you're not doing it alone. You might be by yourself, but you're not alone. You're doing it together with a community online. Now, I still think that community approach is sacramental, because this radically immanent non-ontotheological God is present in that community, which is what brings us back to Emmaus Road. Two friends walking along the road encounter a stranger, sit down for a meal together. In the breaking of bread, their eyes are opened and they recognize Christ in their midst. So it just might be that in every meal we share, when you're just hanging out with a friend, sitting down with your family, having, a Zoom call or a FaceTime call, happy hour, God is present in that moment, in that breaking of bread and drinking of spirits and whatever it might be. If we just open our eyes to see God radically immanent all around us, present in the faces we see across the screen, across the table. So there's my rant on Emmaus Road, communion, and a whole lot of dip your toe into the deep end of theology, church geekiness. Now, let's go fly a drone. Because, this isn't just like we're going to fly a drone to fly a drone. We kind of are. But when we understand God to be radically immanent and non-ontotheologically, sacramentally present, it means that we can see the created world around us, and we have these sacramental eyes to see God everywhere. So, for the next few moments, I'm gonna fly a thing, and you're gonna just watch, because that's how videos work. And I want you to just to kind of, do two things. First, reflect on the question, what do you think about communion? That's kind of a big one, kind of general. And then second, where do you see God? Maybe in those shared meals, maybe in this footage you're gonna see of trees and sun and parks and stuff. All right. We'll be back next week with another episode of The Word Made Fresh. Oh, I almost forgot. Be Still and Go is back with a new season. It's the 7th season. It's a little different. Usually it's a daily show. It's weekly. We're doing a weekly episode, and each reflection kind of connects to something you can actually do, or something you probably already do. For example, the episode that's out right now is all about taking a walk, and it actually follows this exact same text, Emmaus Road, but a whole different kind of angle. You should go to trcnyc.org/BeStillAndGo, click on the episode, it's right there toward the top of the page, or scroll a bit or something. Or just look up Be Still and Go in your favorite podcast app, hit subscribe, and then you got everything right here in your pocket. Now we're gonna fly a drone.